Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Jean Dubranna, and I'm an engineer and project manager at France Énergie Marine. And I really appreciate the fact that you're giving me the opportunity today to talk about green hydrogen production from offshore wind. I thank you for that. So we'll talk about offshore wind in Europe, both the current status and the deployment ambitions. Then just a few words about how to produce hydrogen from offshore wind and how much we can produce and for how much money, of course. So starting with the status of offshore wind in Europe. Okay, so as of mid-2023, there were about 32.5 gigawatt of operating offshore wind farms in Europe. As you can see on this map, a very large majority of this capacity is really deployed in the North Sea by the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, and so on. For the countries of the Atlantic Arc, the deployed capacity remains quite low, typically below 2% of the total European offshore wind capacity. So one reason for this is that deployment conditions are very favorable in the North Sea and a little less in the Atlantic or in the Mediterranean region. So North Sea was targeted first for offshore wind deployment. So this is for 2023. Now for 2050, Europe is committed to decarbonizing its energy production. So the European Commission is planning to multiply by about 10 the capacity of offshore wind by 2050. And of course, the Atlantic area will take its share in that deployment, thanks to essentially increased maturity of the bottom fixed technology, which makes it more cost competitive, and to the ongoing advance of floating offshore wind technologies, allowing to reach much deeper areas, which is very important for the Atlantic Arc, and also better wind resource. So within the next decades, offshore wind will increasingly and massively contribute to renewable energy production along the Atlantic Arc. Well, of course, we cannot expect a lot of hydrogen-dedicated wind farms. Wind farms are essentially here to feed the electricity consumption. But still, we will consider here during this presentation that offshore wind capacity is used for hydrogen production, although we know that only a small part of it will be used for that purpose. All right, so electricity production from offshore wind is renewable. It will be massive, and we're now considering using that electricity to produce green hydrogen. So how do we do that? Well, basically using electrolysis. In one possible configuration, the electrolysis is performed onshore, and the electrolyzer facility is fed by, let's say, a gigawatt scale offshore wind farm that is either bottom fixed or floating. The electricity is transported to between the farm and the onshore electrolyzer using an electrical HVAC or HVDC cable. And in between the electrolyzer and the farm, there is an electrical substation and converters to collect the HVAC electricity from the wind turbines, and if needed, to convert it into HVDC. Once the hydrogen has been produced, it can be stored or connected to the distribution network, or it can be used also for grid services, considering that the electrical grid is expected to have to deal with very significant intermittency related with higher penetration of renewables, or well, hydrogen can also be transported by truck and so on. So this configuration currently would be the most common way to produce hydrogen from offshore wind. Then another way is to produce the hydrogen offshore using a floating or bottom fixed hydrogen facility that is fed again by an electric cable coming from an offshore electrical substation that collects the electricity from the wind farm. This principle is known as the centralized offshore electrolysis. One interest of this principle is that you save the cost of the export electrical cables to the shore, and you replace it by the cost of a pipe, which can be more cost efficient beyond a certain distance from shore and a certain exported power. Of course, this kind of setup needs some technological adaptations and compared to the onshore electrolysis setup. And in particular, the water needed for electrolysis is pumped directly from the sea, and it needs to be desalinated first and treated as well. Then once the hydrogen is produced, you can imagine services like offshore refueling stations. You can also export the produced hydrogen by a ship or store it, etc. So kind of similar to the onshore electricity setup. One last principle would be the decentralized electrolysis, and well, in that case, each wind turbine has its own electrolysis facility on board the wind turbine platform. So what would be the most cost-efficient configuration depending on the geographical position of the farm? Well, the configurations here, there are 4 configurations. 3 of them that I have presented previously, plus there is a distinction between the HVAC and HVDC export cables for the onshore hydrogen production configuration. These are the yellow and green in the screen. So there is a total of 4 different configurations. We can easily see that there is a preference to the onshore HVAC setup close to the shore, wherever you are along the Atlantic arc and even almost in Europe. So this is in green. And then if you go further offshore and deeper, then the other configurations become more profitable. So these are some theoretical previsions for 2030. This is still very theoretical. If we go to 2050, then onshore HVAC production remains, or configuration remains, the most competitive when you are close to the shore. But the cost reductions and technological maturity lead the decentralized configuration to become strongly dominant for the other areas against the 2 other configurations. Of course, again, these studies are very prospective, and of course they need to be challenged by other studies, but it gives us an interesting overview of the different configurations and the different ways to produce electricity and how we anticipate the evolution, the cost evolution of these configurations and of these technologies. Okay, well, I was mentioning that offshore wind deployment is expected to be really massive, multiplied by 10 within about 25 years. But we can wonder what it means in terms of hydrogen production potential. How much hydrogen can we produce from this offshore wind? Well, depending on the studies, the deployment of a 1 gigawatt wind farm dedicated to hydrogen production would yield between 200 and 250 tons of hydrogen per day on average. This corresponds about to 10% of the hydrogen consumption for France in 2023. Well, of course, this value is very, again, theoretical, and there are many, many challenges that need to be lifted before it happens. There are, like, of course, technological challenges, but just like Joaquin said, there are also regulations and acceptation and social acceptance difficulties for this to happen. But it gives a fairly good overview of the potential of green production from offshore wind, what it means, and how much production can be anticipated or considered. Well, I'm going to skip that one. I think otherwise I'm probably gonna run out of time. Maybe we can go back to it later. So it seems like we can produce hydrogen using offshore wind electricity, but how much would it cost? So this figure shows how much hydrogen can be produced from offshore wind in the European waters, and what would it cost for 2020 in it is the black line, 2030 in orange, 2040 in pink, and 2050 in blue. Well, to produce this graph, you basically deploy offshore wind hydrogen plants in the areas that are the most cost competitive first. Then you gradually go to places where hydrogen production becomes more expensive until you reach the production volume that you are targeting. You also have in this graph the current hydrogen consumption in Europe in gray to the bottom of the graph, of the figure, and also the prospecting range of hydrogen consumption in 2050, depending on the scenario. This is in blue, the blue horizontal rectangle. So starting with the theoretical hydrogen production from offshore wind in 2020, we observe that the potential is very high compared to the European consumption, but the cost of that production, even when the best performing areas are exploited, remains very high, even higher than about 4.5 kilograms per per kilograms, which is still more than twice the cost of gray hydrogen. For the future decades, cost reductions rely on offshore wind learning curves, especially for floating wind technologies, where the potential is very high. It also relies on progresses on electrolysis efficiency and basically an overall gain of maturity in the technologies for the production of hydrogen from offshore wind. So These cost reductions may lead green hydrogen to become competitive against gray hydrogen by 2050, and even possibly as soon as 2040, if we are optimistic. And considering that gray hydrogen is becoming more and more expensive due to the price of natural gas. Now, regarding how that production may address the future hydrogen consumption, well, consumption, as you can see on the blue rectangle, consumption is expected to increase a lot, between about 1 and 4,000 terawatt-hour of hydrogen per year by 2050. And of course, offshore wind will not address the whole green hydrogen consumption, but as we can see here, its capacity to very, very significantly address hydrogen consumption at a competitive cost is it can become a reality. But there's still a long way to go, but this capacity should not be overseen if carbon neutrality is required by 2050. Again, we know that we need to be realistic, and we know that hydrogen dedicated wind farms will be very few. But considering the massive, very massive offshore wind capacity that is expected to be deployed, electrical production will necessarily exceed consumption on a regular basis, and producing hydrogen from that exceeding electricity at a competitive cost is one strong possibility and could very significantly contribute to address hydrogen consumption. To conclude, I believe that we all agree that the European ambitions about offshore wind deployment are massive, and this will bring high amounts of intermittent energy into the electricity network, possibly in excess, and using electrolysis to produce hydrogen from offshore wind has a great potential in that aspect. So there are still many challenges to make this happen. First of which is well, probably the production costs, which reduction strongly rely on the decrease of the wind electricity costs, especially for floating technologies. But well, for bottom fixed technologies, cost reductions went beyond expectations. So let's consider that floating technologies will follow the same path. Thank you very much.